still the conversation here on Lagos Television. On the overall, it's been close to, it's been over 11 years that there has been war between Russia and Ukraine. But in the last 3 years, since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, it's been one story from the other. And at the moment, of course, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the moment is in UK trying to rally support from European leaders against the offensive into his country by the Russian president and the Russian military. Of course, last weekend, we also all saw some kind of drama when Zelensky was at the White House, the Oval House in the U.S., and of course, they had that altercation with President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance. And afterwards, has since been in the UK, also meeting with European leaders. Where exactly is this leaving Ukraine and Russia in this offensive? And at the moment, Donald Trump is saying whether or not there could be that talk again, only time will tell. But again, there are calls for the resignation of Zelensky in the face of all of these issues. How far can this actually go? We do have a guest who's joining us via Zoom this morning. Bayo Oluwake is a global affairs analyst. Thank you for joining us on the program this morning, Bayo.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Right, so let's take it from that visit over the weekend where Volodymyr Zelensky was at the White House where he met with President Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. Now, some school of thought are of the opinion that that meeting was actually an ambush for the Ukrainian president. But for you, what did you make out of that meeting?
Well, as you know, I mean, people will have various interpretations based on whatever they've seen and how they're able to analyze it. But essentially, what I think we should keep in mind is that President Zelensky had been in negotiations with the United States. You know, he started this question of offering mineral resources when President Trump kept saying that they had given so much money to Ukraine
in aid,
and therefore they needed to recoup part of their I don't want to call it investment,
but their aid.
Part of the money. Yeah. And so President Zelensky began talking about rare earth minerals, you know, offering mining rights and things like that. So he started that discussion. And that process of engagement had been on in the background, right? Now, the visit to Washington was supposed to have been a visit for him to sign
the deal.
But many of those who had monitored his utterances had suspected that he was not comfortable with the deal he was being offered. And he was going to, even though nobody expected him not to sign it. But I believe that both sides put up some sort of a plan to, on the part of the U.S., some people suggested the U.S. wanted to intimidate him into signing. And on his own part, some others suggested that he was never going to sign. So he needed to also create some dramatic scene that would lead him to not signing the agreement. So from that perspective, I think both sides probably achieved their objective. If it was true the U.S. wanted to intimidate him, because someone started, an official of President Trump started by saying, why are you not wearing a suit? You know, and then President Zelensky himself at some point during the interaction asked, when J.D. Vance, the vice president of the U.S., said we need to adopt diplomacy, you know, President Zelensky went ahead and said, what kind of diplomacy? And I think that turned everything on its head.
Okay. Sorry, Jibala, but sorry, let me just quickly add here. Because Zelensky's first language is in English, do you think maybe also that could have been an issue? Perhaps should he have used an interpreter at that meeting, or you think that, I mean, he understood perfectly what he was getting into?
Oh, he perfectly understood what he was getting into. Presidents don't analyze presidents don't analyze international treaties or international agreements. They have a legal team that does that. And the legal team, whether in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as well as the Ministry of Justice, they do a fine combing of any international agreement.
Okay.
And they advise the president accordingly. So he knew exactly what he was getting into.
Right.
Okay, please educate us this morning if there is anything like a semblance of Animal Farm when it comes to international diplomacy, going by the way and manner Zelensky was treated at the Oval Office on Friday. And you did mention something while you were responding to Abimbola's question that it was actually a ploy by the American government to force him into signing that mineral deal.
Sorry, I didn't get the first part of the question, whether there's something in international
like a
relations.
semblance of Animal Farm, where some animals are more equal than the other, yeah.
Okay, first of all, in international relations, we are told that might is right. And yes, you see, it's something which one might not like to say, but that's the reality. And big powers usually have their way. Big powers will defend their interest with all resources at their disposal. And I mean, you have two contrasting examples. You have Russia, Ukraine. You have Israel, Palestine. You can draw the conclusions yourself. Big powers will always advance their interests, regardless of whatever anybody says. It's been like that throughout history. It is not going to change now. Okay, so that's the first premise, and that will probably answer to the question as to whether the international system is some sort of an animal farm. And then, of course, the question of intimidation. Frankly, I think both sides had a script. If you look at the conduct of both sides, the Americans probably wanted to put President Zelensky under some sort of pressure for him to speak. And President Zelensky apparently had made up his mind he was not going to sign. Okay. So you could see that in the interplay of forces, in the body language and all that. But having said that, there's just something I want to just quickly highlight, because when we discuss Russia-Ukraine, we sometimes tend to miss one point, which is that every country in the international system has a right to determine its own, what we call threat perception. That is, who are my enemies as a state? Which countries are my enemies? Which countries are my friends? Every country has a right to determine that. Now, correspondingly, every country, having determined the threat perception, the threat ranged against it, determines what systems to develop with which to manage, to mitigate, or to neutralize that threat. Ukraine has that right. Russia has that right, just like every country in the international system. Now, when these interests collide, as it happened between Russia and Ukraine, because Ukraine believes it should join NATO. Russia believes Ukraine should not join NATO. Ukraine believes joining NATO guarantees its security. Russia believes that Ukraine joining NATO undermines its own security. With that clash, diplomacy should set in. An organization like the UN should have led the resolution, because that's when diplomacy comes in, when interests clash. But in this case, the UN could not do it. We see the UN has been weakened, and then all sorts of parties came in. And that's what got us to where we are now. And you can see that where we are now, all those parties that got in are all in this for their own interest. If anybody is thinking that there's a country trying to help Ukraine because they are benevolent, there's nothing like that in international relations. They have an interest, and that's what they are all advancing.
Right. Okay, some are of the opinion that this could also be Putin speaking through President Donald Trump one way or the other. Can you give us insights into this? Because many times before now, President Donald Trump has often said he's an ally to President Vladimir Putin. So in that context, is there some kind of pity party from President Donald Trump to President Putin?
Okay, I'll look at it from 2 points of view. There are those who say that President Trump admires strong rulers. If you look, I mean, some people believe that, and they try to draw this conclusion from the way they've seen President Trump act, especially in his first term. And of course, he's coming back during his campaigns, you know, how they project his body language, how they project his utterances. So they've come to this conclusion that President Trump seems to be somebody who is enamored of strong rulers.
Right.
They may be right, they may not be right. The second point I want to advance is that you look at what has been given, you know, because even if we admit that, yes, this is the kind of person Trump is, let's look at the battlefield scenario. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, has given to Ukraine virtually everything in its arsenal. They've given Ukraine Javelin missiles, HIMARS weapon systems, Grad rocket launchers, ATACMS, Storm Shadow missiles, Leopard tanks, Abrams tanks, and now F-16. It has not changed the battlefield scenario.
Right.
If anything, today Russia is occupied by the admission of NATO itself. Russia is occupying at least 20% of the territory of Ukraine, which is normally inhabited by a majority of Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Okay? So as a president, or as somebody who might want to make peace, some people would argue that Trump may be right in insisting that this should come to an end, because there's nothing else for NATO to give to Ukraine.
Sure.
You know, the problem now is what kind of a peace agreement should be worked out? What kind of a ceasefire should be worked out? What kind of concessions should be made? And this is where Russia and Ukraine will be the primary, if you like, discussants, you know, of that process and that, you know, the feature of this kind of agreement. So I think those two perspectives would help. But those who submit that Trump is essentially in love with very strong rulers, they may have a point.
Right.
Okay, the threat by Trump that the United States is going to cut the military aid to Ukraine, what's the implication of that for Ukraine? And would that put Ukraine at a disadvantaged position for Russia to take advantage of it?
I think it will probably make things worse for Ukraine. The truth is that as we speak, the Ukrainian army is not effective anymore on the battlefield. Ukrainian units are holding their positions in certain areas and they are doing very well in those areas. But the overall battlefield scenario is in favor of the Russians. They have momentum. And so, you see, Ukraine has had a lot of challenges. Some of these weapon systems that Ukraine was being given, they are not weapon systems you can use immediately. They are weapon systems that you need to train your army, your air force on for a lengthy period of time.
Okay.
For them to be sufficiently well versed in using those weapons, right? But what is happening is that Ukrainian soldiers are given 6-week training, 2-month training on some of these weapons, maximum 3, 4, 5 months, and they are thrown into the battlefield. And they are confronting a superpower. Because sometimes people forget that. They are confronting a superpower which has also learned some bitter lessons in this war, right? But which has adapted very well. So Ukraine is in a very dire situation. So if America should cut off aid, America is actually the largest supporter in terms of weapon deliveries and financing of the Ukrainian enterprise. Because like all the weapons I mentioned earlier, a majority of them actually are American weapons. Because NATO itself, most of the weapons that NATO uses are all American weapons. So if the US cuts off aid, it will only make things worse for Ukraine.
Okay.
You know? Yeah, exactly.
Right. So if that is the case, and at the moment the US is again saying the deal is off, and we do have President Zelensky running to the UK and meeting with some EU leaders, of course, Starmer, the Trudeau, and a couple of others are now saying they will support Ukraine. But like you've rightly mentioned, U.S. support remains the largest that Ukraine might really need at this particular point in time to surmount the pressure from Russia. So coupled with the help that he's now gotten from the EU leaders, is that enough to again continue in this battle? Or must he retrace his steps and find a way to go back hand in cap to the US?
I think what the EU is doing is just psychological. It's psychological support. Is to make President Zelensky, especially to shore up the morale of President Zelensky, but more importantly, to shore up the morale of Ukrainian soldiers on the battlefield.
Okay.
Let's not forget that those Ukrainian soldiers are also monitoring what is happening, what happened in Washington and so on. So it was important for the EU leaders to immediately do damage control and to reaffirm support for Ukraine. But in reality, the European countries were never expecting that there would be another war in Europe.
Right.
Since the former Yugoslavia disintegrated, and some stability had been made, and some countries had emerged, like Slovakia and so on, you know, Croatia and all of that. They believed that Europe would never experience an armed conflict. And as a consequence of that, many of them reduced their defense budget. Many European countries, it will shock you, cannot field a combat army of up to 5 battalions. They have reduced their budget. That's a fact. Their defense budget, sorry. And therefore, when this war between Russia and Ukraine began, you could see that Europe was just playing catch-up. Between the United Kingdom and France, they both have an air force of roughly just over 1,000 plus fighter aircraft, right? To pitch Europe with Russia, it's a non-starter.
Right.
It's a non-starter. So without the US, in fact, if you listen to Prime Minister Starmer, after he had his press conference and said that when a ceasefire is achieved, the British are willing to put soldiers on the ground. The British army today is probably about just 75,000. Okay, but it's Britain, France, and Italy who seem to have the biggest armies in Europe at the moment. Okay, now he says the British will put troops on the ground and we put planes in the air. He's just giving Zelensky a moral support because the British today do not have the capacity to go to war.
Okay.
By their own assessment, not even by my assessment, by the assessment of even retired British officers, Britain does not have that assessment. They don't have that capability. So without the US supporting whatever the Europeans have agreed to do, it is unlikely to happen. And that's why President Zelensky may have to go back to the US.
Okay, how will this peace deal be structured in such a way that it will be a win-win situation for both Russia and Ukraine? And some people are insinuating that if the pressure is too much on Zelensky, he might be forced to resign or go back to US to go and say, sorry, here I am, I'm ready to sign the deal for the minerals, and of course, go in line with the peace deals that you have tabled before me.
A win-win situation, you know, in war, it's unfortunately, again, it's just hard calculations in international relations, you know. The victor will determine the features of the victory to be decided upon. And that's why you see countries or parties to the conflict always trying to capture as much territory, as possible, because they know that when they finally sit down on the negotiating table, concessions will be made, but then whoever controls much territory has a bigger bargaining power. And that's why Ukraine herself invaded Russia. You remember, They invaded a part of Russia, the Kursk region, hoping to capture territory there with which to now negotiate for the Russians to surrender some Ukrainian territory while they give up Kursk. So it's always going to depend on, to a large extent, how much territory you control, which gives you the bargaining power at the negotiating table. At the moment, I think what President Zelensky has been trying to do is to see if he could still get as much weapons as possible, to still try to see if he could retake some territory or stop the Russians from advancing. Because for the past 8 months, the Russians have been advancing.
Right.
Now, how will that play out in a win-win situation? It's going to be a very tough deal to work out, to be very honest, both for Ukraine and for Russia.
Okay.
I think that...
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, I think that one disadvantage for Ukraine is that the Donbass, which has been the main focus of this conflict, has a significant Russian-speaking people. And these Russian-speaking people, since 2014, were no longer comfortable remaining within Ukraine. I don't want to go into the Minsk agreement because we don't have time. But the Minsk agreement initially was supposed to see those Russian-speaking people become autonomous, have some degree of autonomy within Ukraine. But that agreement was not followed, right? And then we had this full-blown conflict, which now I do not see the Russian-speaking people of Donbass agreeing to remain in Ukraine, which now means that giving up that territory that the Russians control is going to be difficult. And before President Biden left, you remember that the Defense Secretary of the U.S. And a few people were already suggesting that Ukraine may have to give up territory.
That territory.
And I think it's for this reason.
Okay, Jibala, you were going to ask
so if the
question?
pressure is too much on Zelensky now, do you see him resigning or going back to Washington to apologize?
I think that two scenarios can play out. If President Zelensky will go back to Washington, he won't go alone.
Okay.
He will have to go with people like Starmer and President Macron, Prime Minister Starmer and President Macron. He needs some support. He won't go alone, because going alone he might be humiliated. Yes. The second scenario is that he may actually now be forced to resign. And there are even speculations that the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK, General Zaluzhny, who was the former chief of general staff of Ukraine, might actually be the one they are prepping to be the next president.
Okay.
But this is speculation. But I think these two scenarios might play out.
Okay, before we allow you go this morning, two school of thought I'd also like for you to add your voice to hear. I know you did mention now that if Zelensky was to go back to the US, he probably would need to go with Starmer and Macron. But also some are saying that on the side of Russia, perhaps it might need allies like Turkey and China as mediators. Do you also see that happening in the conversation going forward? And is also Ukraine able to, for now, suspend its membership into NATO, since that is one of the reasons or one of the calls by Russia?
No, I don't even think Ukraine can become part of NATO. By NATO's own articles, a country at war cannot be admitted into NATO. Because you remember there's Article 5 in NATO, which means an attack on one is an attack on all. So if a country at war joins NATO, automatically it pulls NATO straight into a war.
Okay.
So I think that Ukraine will need a very long period of stability and peace, to even aspire to that. So I really don't see that happening, and I don't think that even on the part of the Europeans, I don't think that would happen. But they've had to keep up supporting Zelensky and encouraging him. This is not a time to demoralize the Ukrainian military.
Okay.
Now, with the question regarding China and Turkey being mediators, on the one hand, the U.S. is actually, some have said, the U.S. is actually trying to draw Russia closer in order to confront the bigger threat to them, threat in quotes, which is China. Okay? And some have said this is why a lot of foreign policy analysts in the U.S. criticize the Biden administration for, seemingly just allowing all those countries it considered to be threats to the Americans to unite, because that's what happened with the slew of sanctions imposed on Russia. Okay. They thought there should have been some sort of divide and rule, But anyway, the Trump presidency wants to bring Russia on board, according to some people, in order for it to not have the leverage and latitude to confront China. So will China be a mediator in this? China has the capacity, actually, because it's acceptable both to Ukraine and to the Russians. Mm-hmm. Turkey, I think, is also acceptable to both. But I don't think President Trump will welcome any more mediators. I think he would like to do this alone.
Okay. Finally, we also remember that President Trump had also said to Zelensky the other day, you are going through the part of calling for a third world war. What do you make of that statement?
I think it's a statement of fact, whether one likes the way President Trump behaved or not. It's a statement of fact. The Russians have over 6,000 nuclear bombs, missiles. The Americans have slightly over 5,000. If there's any confrontation between both of them, it's straight away we're in a third world war. And let's not forget, the Europeans have always created the problem. Students of history will know that. The First World War was created by the Europeans. It was a problem among the Europeans. Okay. Actually, Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. It was to have ruled Austro-Hungarian Empire. It led to the First World War. The Second World War was a dismembered Austro-Hungarian Empire in Europe, led by Germany, trying to fight back against reparations, according to them. Okay? That's why we had this. But these have always been European problems. Right. But somehow they forced the rest of the world to join them. And it's a good question you've asked, because I think the lesson for us, especially in Africa, is not to get involved in all of this. This is their problem, and they need to sort it out.
Okay. All right. We'll probably have to leave this conversation. And what a way to actually end this conversation this morning. So it is their problem, so they must sort it out by themselves. Thank you so much, Bayo Oluwake, Global Affairs Analyst, for finding time to join us on the program via Zoom.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So we've been speaking with our guest this morning, and he's helped us to take a look at the latest update from the Ukraine and Russian war. Ajibola, if you were to take a cue from what Bayo just said, allow the problem to stay where it is.
I just feel so bad for Zelensky, right? He's like the lapdog of these of these countries, and they are tossing him left, right, and center. So he's helpless as it is. And yesterday he made a statement. He said the road to the peace deal between Ukraine and Russia is still very, very far.
It's really far. And, again, some have said that there is actually no lasting solution to this problem. So they should be taken step by step. But of course, as it is, Zelensky would need to go back to the U.S.
How would he feel going back there?
To go and say, but I said, I'm thankful. But, I mean, he needs to go back if truly there has to be lasting peace.
There are powers and there are powers.
Oh, sure. There are powers and there are powers. And, of course, you can't take away the facts that U.S. remains a power. Yeah. This is what Trump really likes. He loves to be in charge. But there's one thing about Trump that I like, though. He's not a man who loves war.
He doesn't.
He doesn't like anything war at all, and he always wants to ensure that there is no war. It's just that he's not a diplomatic president.
He's not.
He doesn't know how to talk.
His body language on Friday, his conduct, his choice of words were too cocky for me. Yeah, you had a president in front of you, and you were talking to him like he's your boy.
He was talking to the American president.
So he's favored to even be in the Oval Office that Friday?
Yes, now. They told him now that you disrespected the Oval Office
God.
and the White House. All right, we'll take a quick break. When we return, it's over the turn of Adebinkwe to take you through her conversation today.
You're only at the top.